Hello everybody, I'm Nat Coalson, a photographic artist based in the UK. Welcome to the second video in our three-part series covering the Epson SureColor SC-P700 and P900. I started my career working as a graphic designer in the late 80s, and by the early 90s I was really getting heavily into print, and at that time some of the first photo quality inkjet printers were coming out. Flash forward a few years, and around 2003 I started my business in fine art photography. Since then I've done quite a lot of exhibitions. I've shown my work in every kind of venue, and a couple of years ago I opened my own gallery here in England. So I do a lot of printing, both of my own work and for my clients. In this video, I'm going to show you how to print from Adobe Photoshop and Lightroom, and also how to use the Epson Print Layout software. But first, let's talk a little bit about color management. In order to get the best quality prints, you need to be able to trust what you see on screen. If your monitor isn't correctly calibrated and profiled, you may end up with prints that are too dark or the color isn't quite right. These problems are very common, but they can be solved easily if you use the right equipment and procedures. So the solution comes down to using a calibration device. In this case, I'm showing the X-Rite i1 Studio and the i1 Display. You need to have a device to measure your screen or your printed output or whatever you're calibrating for. You can't just do it by your eye, and unfortunately you can't just do it in software either. Now, I wholeheartedly recommend the color management solutions from X-Rite. Your computer has a color management system built into it. Depending on whether you're using Mac or Windows, it may be called something different. On the Mac, it's Color Sync. And a color space describes how many colors are possible. So this means that a device has a color space, like your monitor or a printer, for example, but image files also can have color spaces associated with them. A large color space means there's a lot of colors possible, and a smaller color space means that those colors actually don't exist. So the goal of color management is to translate the colors from your image through the imaging pipeline so that what you're seeing on screen effectively is as close as possible to what comes on the printed output. So to get accurate prints, and by accurate I mean that what comes out of the printer is what you expect. I mean, you have to understand that you're never going to get a truly exact screen to print match, because a screen is a transmissive device where it's, putting out light, and a print is a reflective thing where, how the print looks is entirely dependent on the quality of the light, in the ambient light in the environment, and how it's reflected off a sheet of paper. But I can tell you that if you calibrate and profile your screen and you're using good printer profiles, then you definitely can expect to get pretty close screen to print match, at least close enough that you can predict accurately how the print will come out. But to start, you do need to use a good display. And unfortunately, if you spend just $100 or even a couple £100 on a consumer grade computer monitor, that is never going to be accurate in terms of showing you the true colors of what's in your photographs. Realistically, you need to be looking at sort of the £500 to £600 range, or the equivalent number in dollars, if you really are trying to do good quality photographic work. So you got to start with a decent display. And then also, you need to make sure not to set it too bright. The biggest problem that I see sort of across the board is that a lot of people will unknowingly set their monitor brightness far too high, and then of course when you make a print, well, the print looks a lot darker simply because what you're seeing on your screen is not correct or accurate as to what's actually in your image file. So starting with a good display, setting it to a correct brightness, calibrating and profiling it, those things in and of themselves will get you 90% of where you need to be for getting an accurate print. And then you need to be using good quality printer profiles. And by using the correct ones, I mean most often you can get printer profiles from whoever made the paper. So if you're using Epson, for example, they provide printer profiles for all of their media. So you need to use the correct and good quality profiles as well. So now we're ready to get into photo printing. So we've gone through a quick edit and some develop adjustments in Lightroom, and now we are at a place where we're ready to make a print. So we'll just quickly, establish some of the basic goals, what we're trying to accomplish in our printing. First and foremost, especially in terms of photography as art, we're trying to maintain the best possible quality. But we also don't want to take too long doing it. Speed is important, and you will find that the more that you do these things, obviously, the more efficient you'll get at it. We need to keep our print workflow non-destructive, and any of the other adjustments you'd make in Lightroom or Adobe Camera Raw. You need to be able to change your mind or adjust things as the need arises. You need to have repeatable results. And by this, I mean that if you make a print today that you're happy with, you need to be able to replicate that result, 6 months or years from now, and have a high degree of confidence that the result will be as good every single time. That being said, you need to still have some room for improvement. And as the equipment improves, as your methods and your skills improve, as you're capturing better images, it is reasonable that your print should keep getting better and better. Quick overview of our printing workflow. We're going to finalize the master file where you've got your original, you're making your adjustments directly to it. We are not going to make any adjustments or changes to our master file specific for any given print job. You need to work up the master file so in and of itself you're pleased with it, and then you would use derivative copies or separate print files depending on the print job that you're doing. So you need to first finalize that master file where you're happy with it on your calibrated and profiled screen. You need to decide on the size that you're going to print, and you do have a couple of different sizes to consider here. One is the live image, or how the printed ink sort of sits on the paper, and then you have the sheet size. So depending on whether you're using a cut sheet or a roll feed media, there is some maths involved, and you need to kind of be clear on the sizes that you're working with. Choosing your media is going to be down to not only budget and what may be immediately available, but you want to be thinking in terms of picking each paper or canvas or whatever is your type of media should, be a good match for the image itself. Now, preparing print files, especially if you're using these derivative copies I'm talking about specifically for each job, this opens up a possibility that you can make some adjustments specifically for a given print condition. Going through your page setup and printer driver settings, this would be something that you do enough to get routine and a set of habits that you can repeat, again and again. But realistically, you got to check every one of these settings each time that you go through the job, because you never know if something has been reset to the default or if maybe something has been left from another print job. So I'm going to go over that with you. Checking the printer setup in terms of, ink levels, doing a nozzle check. And then after you've done all these things, then you will cue the job for the output. So here we are in the Lightroom print module, and I have this image. I'll just use this as our printing example. So within the print module in Lightroom, the first thing always to do is check your page setup. And I do this first because your paper and page size here, as well as things like orientation and scale, that is also fundamental to getting set first, because then that is what will lead to all of the other measurements and the settings that you would apply in the layout panel. So the first thing, of course, is to choose the correct printer. And I've got selected here the Epson P900. I almost always try and print in portrait orientation, which sometimes means making a page setup that is wider than it is tall. For example, if I'm using a canvas or a roll feed type of media. But printing in portrait orientation always makes things a lot easier, because this is generally the way that your paper is going to be feeding through, with the the short side is feeding through the printer. So again, I'll first select the printer, because a lot of the paper options and sizes will be driven by what printer is selected. For this example, maybe I'll just change from A3 and I'll just shift it to A2. Now, A2 is a sheet, and it's going to be using default margins. You can see that with the Epson P900 and P700, the current series of papers provide a lot of different options for how the papers are being fed through, and that's actually selected first here in the page setup. So that's very important, that if you're using, for example, the front paper feeder, that you would select that here. Really important, because the rest of your settings and the printer control panel stuff is going to be all driven by this selection. Make sure that we set the scale to 100, because we're going to have Lightroom, or in the case of Photoshop, which I'll show you next, we'll have the apps can actually be establishing the scale, but we want in page setup, it's going to be going 100%, and we're going to use portrait orientation. So I'll click OK there. Now that I have set the page size to A2, the rest of the setup in Lightroom has to do with how the image or multiple images may be positioned on the page. In this case, you can see on the toolbar here, I've got just to use selected photos, and I only have the one photo selected. But if I select multiple photos, then you see that I end up with a print job with multiple pages. Okay, so I can actually select multiple images here, and then Lightroom will output each one on its own page. That's only because of the way that these settings are placed. If I wanted to put, for example, 4 images on one sheet of paper, then over here on the layout grid, now I actually skipped over one part. I want to make sure you understand this. I am using what's called the single image or context sheet layout style. In a lot of ways, this is the simplest, most straightforward way to lay out a sheet. And especially if you really are just printing one image, then it's going to be a lot easier just to use this one rather than these packages, which are designed for printing multiple photos at multiple sizes. So with a single image or contact sheet, all of the images, whether it's one or more, on a given sheet of paper are going to be at the same size, which for our purposes here is perfectly fine. So to place these multiple on one page, all I have to do is change our page grid. So you see now where before I had 4 pages with one photo on each page. Now it's one sheet of paper with 4 images. And then from here, you can just adjust the spacing. Now you can also double click and enter in very precise values here. And most of the time, if I'm being careful and, printing a, proper job, then I will absolutely be super careful and, trying to do my maths as best as I can and add things up here so that your sizes are exactly right. Now, the most important thing in a layout like this, of course, is going to be what's called the cell size. And down here at the very bottom, this is saying the height and the width. So each of these images then is in a box, effectively controlled by this sizing. So you'll note that we're not seeing any guides currently. If I go down here to the guides panel, I can show the guides. And now you can see how each of these images is placed within its respective cell. I'm just going to go back to one image per page. And we're going to say we want to print this, say, at 15 inches high by 10 inches wide. Okay, so you just type that in exactly. Now, you can change your ruler units up here. So if you're more comfortable working in metric, then choose that here. Otherwise, in most cases, I will enter in a specific size here and then adjust the margins depending on this size. But it is possible though, if you start changing these, then depending on the size of your sheet of paper and your margins and how it all adds up, you see how it's starting to change here. So you really got to keep an eye on that. And so the main thing is to set your size and see when I try and put 15 back in, well, it won't let me because these margins up here actually, kind of override everything. So what if I just put these all to their minimum? Every printer is going to have kind of its own defaults for what's the minimum margins, but then at least I can put in what is the exact size, and you'll see that Lightroom places it in the center on the sheet. So for all intents and purposes, this print job is ready to go, right? I mean, let's say we're happy with 10 by 15 inches on an A2 sheet. We've already done the page setup and selected the printer and the paper size. We've set the layout. Just close these panels, and next you go down to the print job panel. Now, first and foremost, we do not want to be using draft mode because, as the name implies, that's not best quality. That's just going to be a very quick, low resolution preview. Make sure that you have selected that it is going to the printer rather than to a JPEG file. Now, print resolution may be a little bit confusing. If this box is checked, then Lightroom will resample or resize the images using this number of pixels per inch for each image, regardless of what the original native resolution may be. If this is unchecked, then Lightroom will send the print job to the printer using whatever resolution it ends up being. Okay, so I think in most cases, unless you're absolutely sure of the resolution this image would be at this size, you're probably better off just leaving that checked. And then on Epson printers, 240 is kind of our sweet spot. That's ideal. Sometimes I may go up to 360, but that is extremely rare. Most of the time I'll do 240. Now, those are multiples of kind of magic numbers that just nicely match up with the arrangement and the sizing and alignment of the piezo print heads, the nozzles on the Epson printer. So 240 is kind of our sweet spot there. Print sharpening, I would always add some print sharpening depending on the image and how much it's being enlarged and what's the resolution. Standard is fine. You can choose between matte or glossy media type. Matte is going to be a stronger amount of sharpening than glossy. And then 16-bit output. Again, we don't have enough time really to get too deep into this, but if your image is 16-bit or it's RAW and your printer driver supports 16-bit, then on some images, having 16-bit, can provide a better quality, potentially, maybe in smooth gradations, like in this type of area. But for most images, for example, like this image, you would never see a difference whether or not it was printed as 16-bit or not. So I generally don't bother with 16-bit output. The rule of thumb is if you don't need it, leave it unchecked. So next we'll go down to the color management section of the print job panel. This is one of the most important parts of setting up the print job in Lightroom. First, we want to make sure that Lightroom is using the correct printer profile to output this job. We do not want it managed by printer. This means that the color management is going to happen through a printer profile. Now, apologies that this menu is cut off, but you can see here that there are a few printer profiles in this menu that had been registered previously. If I click Other and then open this window, we can see these are all of the printer profiles that are registered on this system. And so let's say if I want to use luster photo paper, then I would check the box here, click OK, and now you see Lightroom has loaded that profile. This is the best way to ensure correct color management, not letting the printer manage it. Now, the rendering intent, for most jobs, I use relative. The only time I might use the perceptual intent is when there's some very maybe saturated colors or color relationships between very saturated colors. So if you're really into fine-tuning your color management, you owe it to yourself to learn a little bit more about how perceptual and relative rendering intents work. But most of the time I will use relative. I do not apply any print adjustment here. These controls are very crude, and they're really not a replacement for using correct color management procedures, especially if you've got a good quality computer display and it's been profiled and calibrated correctly. Then using the correct profile, this should give you a good match. So you should not have to be doing much down here in terms of print adjustment. Now that I have selected the color management options and chosen the profile, next I will go to the printer dialog box here. And when I click the printer button, this brings up the print driver panel. The software and the options that you actually are seeing in this section are all provided by the Epson printer driver. Okay, so the first thing, I have gone down to printer settings, and we want to choose the type of photo paper. Now, on the latest versions of Epson printers, if you choose use printer settings, then the media type actually is determined on the printer itself using the control panel. But we can choose photo paper luster, print quality. Let's just say quality options. This gives you a range of slider adjustments here, so you can choose. Now, for almost every photo, 1440 is going to be totally appropriate. Black Enhance Overcoat is a black boost, effectively, that are with the latest versions of Epson printers. This is an option that lays down some additional gray inks, actually, that will give deeper shadows. High speed means that the printer head will print on both passes as it's going across. Pretty much I'll always just leave finest detail, but these are the settings really that you want to see, that the media type is either selected by the printer, or if you've got an older printer, then you have no choice but to just make your best selection here. Now, as long as this matches up with what you've chosen as your profile, then you should be good to go. And when you go down here and go through some of these other options, again, all of these settings are being controlled by the printer driver itself. If you click on Advanced Color Settings, you'll see that we are using Color Sync. So this is a correctly color managed job. If you come in to your print dialog box and you see anything other than this, then something is wrong. And if you're using the Mac, it could be that that your printer is set up to use AirPrint, and that's not the correct way to do it. I would recommend that you do a little research and learn about how you need to install the correct Epson driver settings, and never ever use AirPrint on Mac. These are the settings that you should see when you come into the print dialog box. And at this point, then, I am ready to click the print button and send the job to the printer. So as you can see, when you've got a lot of images to print, Lightroom can be a great choice. But usually, if I'm just printing one photo, I'll use Photoshop. Now, to print this photo in Photoshop, it takes a different set of steps. So here we have the image opened in Photoshop. And before I go into the print screen, I think I will spend just a quick minute showing you the soft proofing option that I mentioned earlier. So under the View menu, if I choose Proof Setup and then Custom, you'll see that this window comes up that allows me to preview on screen what this image will look like when printed to a certain printer using a certain paper. Here's some that I have saved from before. So if I go to Premium Luster, then you can see that Photoshop is simulating on screen what this image would look like on my Epson 9890 using Epson Premium Luster. And then you can see there's a preview box here we can check and uncheck. So you can see that in the soft proof condition, it's a little bit duller, or not as vibrant and saturated. The color is maybe a little bit cooler. There's a little bit of a blue tint. It's not as contrasty. There is one option here that isn't on by default though, and that's this simulate paper color. That is really important to have on, because you'll see that without simulating the paper color, there really is not much difference at all in your on-screen preview. I mean, you really need to be seeing what is the color of the paper. Now, all of this really is preempted by the need for having your screen calibrated and profiled. If you're not able to trust what you see on screen, then doing a soft proof like this really is not going to be any good. There's no point in doing it unless you have a very accurate display. But presuming that you've used one of the X-Rite products and calibrated, profiled your monitor, and you've set your brightness correctly, then I can tell you that using this soft proof is a really good way to train your eye to seeing how the image will look when it's printed under these conditions. Now, here again is the rendering intent, just like in Lightroom, and you can choose between perceptual and relative, and you can see an on-screen preview of how each of those would look. Now, Lightroom does also have soft proofing in it, and when you soft proof in Lightroom, one of the options is that you can create a proof copy of the image so that you can make adjustments directly onto it. And this gets back to using a derivative files where you're proofing to a certain condition, and then maybe you want to make some slight adjustments, like maybe I'd want to pump up the contrast, or increase the saturation, or take a little bit of that blue hue out. You would do all of those types of adjustments using your soft proof, but you'd have to be doing that on a copy. Again, because we're not going to modify our master file just for this one print job, because there's nothing that says you might not be using a different printer or a printer model or a different paper or some other conditions in the future. So you need to leave your master file intact and only do your soft proofing and any edits based on soft proofing using copies of the files. Okay, so I'm just going to cancel out of this. So we're back to our normal preview here. Now, to print from Photoshop, I'll go under the File menu and go to Print. Now, this brings up the print window. Let me just fit it into the screen here. Okay, so you can see that the print setup is quite different. So the first thing, again, I need to choose my Epson P900. Then, just like in Lightroom, we need to choose that for color handling, we don't want the printer managing the color. We want Photoshop managing the color, and we want to choose the correct printer profile. And we'll do it exactly the same as we did in Lightroom, where you have the profile selected in here. So now Photoshop will send this print job to the printer using the settings contained within this profile. Okay. Now you notice the size. You can see that the image is cut off and it's not positioned correctly on the paper. One of the tricky things about printing from Photoshop, I'm just going to cancel here quickly. One of the tricky things about printing from Photoshop is that you really want to size and rotate and set everything on your image file to exactly what it is that as you want to print it before you actually open that print window, so that what you're sending through the print screen is, that you're not doing any enlargement or rotation or anything like that in the print window. You need to do it on this image for the most reliability. So to do that, I'll go under the image size, and just using our example that we did in the last one, I want to use 15 by 10 inches at 240 pixels per inch. I'm going to use resampling, and I'll just put this on automatic. That's usually your best bet. So 10 by 15 inches, 240 pixels per inch. Let Photoshop resample this image, And there we go. So I'll just zoom in a little bit here. All right, so the other thing is that, as I mentioned earlier, I always like to print in portrait orientation. So to do that, I'm actually going to rotate this. So if I go under the image rotation, 90 degrees clockwise. Okay, and I'll just fit this into the window. Okay, so this is actually how I'm going to print this job, right? And the reason I do this is because the positioning and scaling of an image in Photoshop using these controls is really unpredictable and very difficult, and you'll waste a lot of time and a lot of paper and ink. So if you just size it to what you want, maybe sharpen it. I didn't do any additional sharpening. I'd probably do one pass of unsharp mask print sharpening on here before going into here. At this point then, because I have selected my printer profile, I'm just positioning it central on the page. I've got the correct printer chosen here. If I go into print settings, then at this point, when I choose my paper size, and again, if I go down to these same options as what we saw in Lightroom, that I can use the printer settings, or I can use luster photo paper, print quality, right? So it's exactly the same. Uncheck that. That black enhance overcoat is probably best only for certain types of images. But this is what you want to see, and it really does look exactly like in the print driver in Lightroom, and it's because we are actually looking at Epson sort of software here. This is provided by the printer manufacturer, not by your print software, but not by Photoshop or Lightroom. This is printer driver stuff. So you would always set this up the same way, and this is what I meant earlier when I was talking about, you know, having a sequence of steps. The way that you set up your print job in the printer driver here, the only things really that you would be changing is your media type, you know, maybe on rare occasion, you know, the resolution or the quality, right? And maybe some of this stuff, but this is all like minor adjustments. Whereas as long as you've got the correct media type selected here, and as long as you have Photoshop managing the color with the profile here, your color will be accurate. And at this point then, I can print the job. So over the years, I've done most of my fine art photo printing from Photoshop or Lightroom. But now photographers have a new option, and it's called Epson Print Layout. So here we are in Epson Print Layout, and you can see that the window interface is quite minimal. I would just point out a few things about the interface to make things a little easier for you. First of all, you can change the size of the window by dragging on the sides and the corner, and you can see all of the panels resize. You can change the size of the individual panels by clicking and dragging on these little tabs in the middle. And you can also go full screen. Now I'm on a Mac here. You could do the same thing on Windows, but on Mac it's clicking this little green button, and now we're in full screen. I'm just going to briefly go back to not full screen just to show you the process of getting the images into the program, because there are a couple of different ways to do it, and one way using drag and drop would sort of presume that you can see your desktop. So continuing briefly our tour of the interface, you've got just a few basic menus up here. There's not really much to be done up here. So under the File menu, the one command that you might use is Open. And the Open command is Epson Print Layout's way of bringing images into the program. So if I click Open, you can see I've got a folder created here with images that I've previously saved out. You may have already noticed, but maybe it's worth pointing out, that there are no editing controls provided here. Epson Print Layout very strictly is designed for laying out and printing your finished images. So you'll need to use other software to get your images ready. And then when you have TIFFs or JPEGs or other image file formats, you can bring them into Epson Print Layout to do the actual printing. So again, under the Open menu, if I select one or all of the images, you can hold on a Mac the Command key, or on Windows the Control key, and select individual images. If I click Open now, you'll see that the images get added in to this preview thumbnails area down here. So these are the images that I had just selected, and you can see I can go through and click each one. Now it's also worth pointing out that you may open up Epson Print Layout and see some default page size and a paper size with a page setup, and that is going to be one of the first things that we're going to need to set. As it stands now, all of these images are being placed onto the same page size, and we don't really know what that is until you look down here and see it listed. 5.93 by 4.13 inches is our paper size. And you've got a display also here for the resolution. So obviously one of the first things we're going to need to do is set our paper size. I'm going to come back to that briefly though. First, I'm going to clear out these images and show you another way to import or open your images into Print Layout. So to remove images, I'm just right-clicking on these and choose Eject. Okay, so the two commands are Open to add them in and Eject to get rid of them. Now you can see I've cleared out the layout, and you can see it says image not loaded. Okay, so the other way to add images into Epson Print Layout is by drag and drop. So here's this folder of images, and I've just opened it on my desktop. I still have the Epson Print Layout window in the background. Now, if I select one or a few images, I can drag and drop them right into this film strip preview area. That sometimes I think is going to be a little bit easier than going to this Open command and then navigating through your file system, but it depends where your photos are stored and how easy they are to access. So I'm going to go ahead and eject all of these again because I do want to bring them all in at once. Okay, so I'll just do a select all, drag and drop, and now all of these images in this folder will be added in to Epson Print Layout. Okay, and now at this point, I think I would like to go ahead and enlarge the window to fill the screen. So I will just drag to resize some of these others. And then there is also a zoom control here, which is actually zooming into the layout, as you can see. Okay, so I've turned on my cursor utility so you can follow where I'm going on the screen with this little purple circle when I move the cursor. Okay, so there's a sequence of steps, like with most software, that you're going to want to go through. And in almost all cases, the first thing you're going to want to do is select the printer and choose the paper size. I just remembered one other thing. Before I get into that, up here are these two buttons which control the visibility of the Browse thumbnail area and this Settings tab, which is on the side. So if you need more room, you can open and close these. If you open up Epson Print Layout and your thumbnails or the settings are not visible, use these buttons up here. You can also save presets. So as you go through and make changes to your layouts and your color settings, then by all means, it'll save you a lot of time to save your presets for later. Okay. So again, the first thing we want to do is select the printer. So we'll start at the top here with printer settings. So I have the printer selected, the SC-P900, and you can see any other printers registered and installed in your system would be visible here. The next thing to choose, just sort of working top to bottom, is your media type. Now, these are all the Epson built-in default media types that come with the printer driver. You'd have to refer to the printer documentation or maybe the media documentation more accurately If you're using a third-party paper type that doesn't exactly match with one of these Epson types, there will always be a recommendation of which one to use. For this example, I'll just use Premium Photo Paper Luster. The next setting here is paper size. You can create your own custom sizes as well. Most of the time, especially if you're printing on sheet-fed media, it's going to be a lot easier just to use the built-in standard sizes, especially A sizes if you're working with ISO paper sizes. But you can see it's got some North American paper sizes in here as well, and a lot of the sort of standard sort of photographic print sizes are built in as well. Okay, so let's just say we want to do A2, just to take advantage of what the P900 can accommodate. Paper source, pretty simple choices here. You've got sheet, and whether it's sheet with margins or borderless. As explained in video number 1 of this series, I almost never print borderless. So I most often would be using sheet if I'm using a cut sheet media. But you can see that there's also options for roll paper, as well as if you're feeding very thick poster board or other thick media through the front paper feeder, then there's options here. So maybe it goes without saying that you need to choose this very carefully, and it needs to go sort of along with what you've set as your paper size. These settings here are going to largely determine the rest of your options and your workflow as for how the images are positioned onto the paper. So the quality setting here, this, if you've been using the Epson driver within Photoshop or Lightroom, you would have seen this before. These are all the most recent, as of the recording of this video, these are all the most recent settings that are provided through the Epson printer driver. And you can see that, there's not a slider adjustment. So you kind of have to do a little bit of research to know what each of these are in terms of the actual dots per inch resolution that's being printed. And then you'll notice here also that there is a special selection for carbon black, which is a special ink treatment provided by the P900 and P700 to really give you the deepest possible blacks. Okay, but obviously that is only going to be really appropriate or useful on certain images with certain papers as well. So I would probably normally use either high quality or max quality. And, this really does bear doing some testing of your own. And your choice here might also depend on what media type you've selected. So if we were to be printing, for example, on some of the newer fine art papers, which generally use the ultra smooth media type, your options are going to be different here. Okay, so you've got standard or max quality because these are tied in to the media type. So just understand that what you see in each of these menus changes on the fly, and that's why it takes a minute for all the settings to load and reload when you make a change. So I'll just leave it on high quality. There's another option provided with the latest model of printers and the drivers, and that's black enhance overcoat. Again, similar to the carbon black, this is to boost your blacks, and I would encourage you to do a little more research on your own as to what type of circumstances this is going to be most appropriate. It's a little bit outside the scope of these videos. Okay, so that is the printer settings panel. I'm just going to close this up now, and we'll go down to the next section, which is layout. So you've got the first menu is type, and this is giving you some built-in previews and layout styles to help with different types of print. So a gallery wrap is expecting that you are going to be wrapping the image around the edge of a set of gallery stretcher bars, which I think is a really interesting and very useful function. If you like to have your image wrap around the sides, you see you can change the depth, including putting a custom depth on it. You can control how much overlap there is, whether or not trim marks are actually being printed. Now, you should note that these dotted lines, these shouldn't print, but these little corner marks will print. Okay, and so you can also use mirror image. As you can see that that's what it's doing here. It's taking the width of the image and going inward and then reflecting that back out. So that's the mirror image effect. If you choose none, then this will just be added depth here, unprinted canvas. We can choose wrap image, where it's actually effectively just cropping it to the size of your canvas, with the sides, just the image wrapping around. And if you're doing canvas wraps, you know, this is something that you're going to want to spend more time on and experiment with. Again, a little bit outside of the scope of what we're doing now. And same goes for template. Like all of these layout types have quite a bit more room for exploration and setting up for your types of print jobs, especially considering that once you've set all of these in here, then you can create your own presets. Okay, so again, we're just going to use standard orientation. Now you can see orientation is the orientation for how it's shown on the screen, as well as how the images are placed onto the page. And you can see that as I choose a portrait oriented image, it does change the orientation of the preview. And here's a square one, and you can see that it has automatically selected portrait orientation. Okay, so the software is pretty clever in knowing or assuming that the orientation that you bring the image in, that is the orientation that you want it printed. And the idea here is that the image would be, each image would be positioned on the sheet to, you know, match the long side to the long side. And then as it's going through the printer, it will automatically switch so that the short dimension is the edge being fed through the printer, and then your images are being positioned on the page depending on their actual orientation. Okay, you've got an option for scale to fit here. I have to say I'm not really the biggest fan of something like this, because we don't really know by checking this what exactly the size will be. So I would prefer to uncheck that and set your size manually here. So you've got a couple of other measurements here, left and top. These are margins, right? So as I enlarge these, I mean, they're going to be tied to the size as well, so there's only so much you can change without changing another one, right? So you work these sliders sort of together to get the positioning that you want. Now, dragging them is not always going to be the easiest way. If you know the exact size that you want to print these on the sheet, then your best bet is to just enter them in. Now, as is sort of similar to the other examples that I typically use, let's use a 10 by 15 inch print on an A2 size sheet. So in this case, and I have only just randomly sort of stopped or selected this image as my example. There's nothing sort of unique or special about this one. I would point out, though, that this one is a 2 by 3 aspect ratio, which you can pretty clearly see. So I'm going to be using the 2 by 3 aspect ratio for my sizing, whereas this one is not a 2 by 3 aspect ratio. So let's just see what happens if we set our width and height to 10 by 15, which is a 2 by 3 aspect ratio. We now go back to this one, and you can see that it has its own settings. So that really illustrates the fact that each image in this print job can have its own position and sizing on the sheet of paper, which can be pretty handy if you are really trying to queue up a print job and do a whole lot of images at once. So what you would do is go through one at a time, each image, and set your parameters here. Like let's say I want this one 18 inches by 12 inches. And let's choose centered. Okay, so that is that one at 12 by 18. This one, let's say we wanted at 10 by 15 centered. Okay, now you think, well, this one I want the same as the previous one. So I think this is a good time maybe to create a preset. So I'll create a new preset and call it 10 by 15. And of course you can name these however you want. I'll call it 10 by 15 landscape. Okay, now when I get to this one, I can just choose that preset. Okay, so presets are really going to make things a lot faster for you, even within a given individual print job. Okay, here we are back to a vertical. Let's say I want this one to be 12 inches by 18 inches high, and again we want to just center it. So you can really quickly see that as I go through the positioning and sizing and scaling, all of the measurements are very specific to each individual image, which really can be a huge time saver. This is actually quite a bit more flexibility than even what you get in something like Lightroom, where setting up a print job in this way with different sizes and aspect ratios would be quite a challenge within one given print job. Okay, so one other thing that I haven't pointed out is that you can also print an additional color in the margins. Again, this is going to depend on what is the size of your image on the sheet, and what are you going to be doing with it in terms of mounting and framing. So let's say we want this one at 12 by 18 and we want that one centered. Okay, so you can see that it's really pretty easy to add an additional color as a border or a background in your margins. Okay, so let's just say I've gone through all of my images, and I haven't because I don't want to take the additional time now. But let's say I've gone through and set all these. I'll at least do this one as centered. Okay, so now that we've gone through layout, this section is all about color management. And we've touched on color management a number of times in earlier videos. The important thing here is that we never, well, I say never, almost never, I can't think of a situation where we want to allow the printer driver to control the color. So one of the first things we need to do is change it to use ICC profile. Okay, and then you can see that the print layout software is pretty clever in that it has an auto select. It based on your media type up here. If you've chosen a certain, especially Epson printer media, then leaving it on auto select is going to select the correct ICC profile within your system, assuming that it can find it and it's installed. Rendering intent, as I've mentioned before, is something sort of for your own study and your own testing, whether you prefer one or the other. I almost always print with relative colorimetric. That's worth a little bit more research on your part. Always, 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 black point compensation must be turned on. Okay, so under ICC profile, if I wanted to choose a different profile, I can do that here. Let's say that I was actually printing on a third-party paper, but that it was a good match to the Epson Premium Luster. For example, over the years I've made a lot of my own custom profiles, for Gold Silk and some other third-party paper brands. So I've gone through and made my printer settings. I've done my layouts. I've selected to use a profile. At this point, it's also worth considering, would I want to save another preset for this? And then I am ready to click print. Although you will note that there is an option for how many copies here. When I click the print button, you can see that it is actually sending the print data already. So this is effectively bypassing all of the printer drivers settings, which normally would be the place where you'd be making all of, not so much layout, but certainly printer settings and color settings. Prior to Epson Print Layout, all of these were what you would do in the printer driver settings. You can see that the printer driver is effectively self-contained within Epson Print Layout, and so when you click print, it is going to the printer and we'll start queuing the print job. These examples I've shown you in Epson Print Layout were all based on using a single image per sheet of paper. But you can also create layouts with multiple photos using drag and drop. Once you've made your prints, you may want to think about mounting or framing and presenting your work, and we'll look at that in our next video. Thanks for watching.